think we'll start with what is a bit traditional. I just added this today. Realized yesterday was Indigenous Peoples Day, or also Columbus Day. And this is a map of Washington that our Office of Tribal Affairs uses to show where the tribal affiliations and reservations and things like that are. In Washington State, we have 29 federally recognized tribes and a number of other tribes that are not federally recognized. I am coming from the very low end, the south end of the Puget Sound in Olympia, Washington, and so a couple of the tribes that are close to me are the Nisqually tribe, the Squaxin Island tribe, and there are a number of other tribes that are close by. And I recognize that for a couple of reasons. One is that our Office of Tribal Affairs pointed out to me that these lands were often ceded under duress in treaties, and that part of that treaty negotiation was that we would provide health care for those tribes. And of course, we're the healthcare authority, and so this is pretty relevant. And so for some time, I wasn't quite clear why we always did the land acknowledgement, and it's clear to me now. And so I thought I'd better go ahead and just acknowledge that that's a reality that we face, and so have been honored to work with our tribes for a long time, as well as our Office of Tribal Affairs. Again, great partners, and we appreciate them taken care of the land for so long. And I'll be spending quite a bit of my time today talking about some of the places that we're at, and interspersing that with some of the story we talk about data, because I think they're interconnected. So my name is Paul Davis, and prior to being here at the Healthcare Authority Division of Behavioral Health and Recovery, I used to work at the Washington State Department of Health. And in that work, I was tasked with managing the Tobacco Prevention and Control Program, also launched the Marijuana Prevention Program when marijuana became legalized over a decade ago. And I remember in that work, we were identifying disparities as a component of what we were trying to address. And while in Washington State, we cut smoking rates very substantially to like half of what they were for kids, and quite a bit for adults. We did less well with reducing disparities, and in some places, I think we actually increased those disparities, so that the overall population might be smoking less, but there were some populations that really didn't come down much at all, and so that meant that the disparity between groups of people actually increased. And one of the pointed things that I remember, it was we operated a quit line, we still do. And I'd get feedback from our partners in the African American community saying, this just isn't working for us. And I said, well, what do you mean? We've got really good data to show that African Americans are calling the quit line at pretty much the rate we expect them to. And they agreed. And then they came back and says, yeah, but look at our quit rates. And sure enough, when we looked at the quit rates, African Americans were quitting at a much lower level than whites were quitting at, in many other groups. And so it became apparent to me that access to services doesn't mean the same thing as getting the same outcomes as other people. And it was tough to get hard data on that because we just didn't have it very well, but it was pretty clear. And now, as we're, a decade later, we know that that's the case, that we have those kind of disparities. As I came over to the Healthcare Authority, it was exciting to be working in a place where we were going to have individualized outcomes data. And so that's some of the stuff that I want to talk to you about. We'll be talking about CANS, the child and adolescent needs and strengths, and finding a way to quantify that story to look for disparities. This picture in the background was captured a few months ago. My wife and I spend a lot of our time going out looking for whales. Sometimes we're seeing from shore, sometimes we're on our sea-doo that we go out in the sound. I think this one was from shore, if I remember right. And there are two different kinds of orcas. There are southern residents, which are very endangered and don't see those very often. And then there are the bigs or the transients. This particular one was a transient group, and I forget which group it was, but as I was looking at the video, I didn't notice it at first, and then I thought, "Oh, wait, that's a little one. That's a little calf that's with snuggling up against his mom." And so it took some extra looking at what I had captured to find out exactly what I got, and that's, I think, relevant to what we're going to talk about today. Is sometimes you find some gems in there that you just weren't aware of at the beginning, and don't want to overlook any data that you captured. And if you don't capture the data, then you can never go back and look at it again. But if you've got it, sometimes that extra look can get you some pretty interesting stuff. So I'll spend some time just letting you get grounded. I swim in these waters every day of Wraparound with Intensive Services or WISE, but I don't expect anybody else does. And so I'll just kind of let you understand just the world that we're working in. In Washington State, it seems like nothing ever happens without a lawsuit or some kind of settlement agreement, or in many cases, a voter initiative. WISE was one of those things that came from a lawsuit. The plaintiffs said we're, as a state, putting way too many young people in hospitals, jails, and institutions. And we agreed. And we said, yeah, that's really the case. We got too many of our young people that we could avoid putting in those restricted settings if we had the right kind of mental health interventions. And so that resulted in Wraparound with Intensive Services being created and implemented. WISE is what we call it. And we base that on system of care and wraparound principles. Some of you may be kind of familiar with those principles. It's important things like nothing about us without us, making sure that we're outcomes based, making sure that that we're using not just formal supports or people that are paid to care, but natural supports too. And so we use our state plan mental health services as the intensive services in WISE, or the Wraparound with Intensive Services. And one of the important things is that we want to make sure we're meeting participants where and when that they want to be met. Under traditional outpatient services, you would get an appointment and say, all right, come into the office at 9:30 on a Tuesday. And you can imagine if you're maybe a mom of a kid that's got problems, that means you got to find a way to get you and the kid to the place they're supposed to go at 9:30 on a Tuesday. Good chance, since we're dealing with people that are on Medicaid, you might have problems with transportation, and that's a challenge to get to a place at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, just because your transportation is a problem. The other thing is you may have other kids that you got to drag with you. That's a real challenge. And so the expectation for us is we want to meet when and where is convenient for the youth and the family. So if they want to be meeting at 5:30 at their home rather than at 9:30 at the office, that's what we do. And if they want to meet at a park, we'll meet them at a park at a time that's meaningful for them too. We use those state plan services, so things like individual therapy, group therapy, psychoeducation, med management, crisis services. Those are all things that are paid for with Medicaid as part of the state plan. And then there are some additional state funds that fund things that aren't part of the state plan. And those include things like the Child and Family Team Meeting. Not a great name because we're serving people that are from birth up to the age of 20. And I don't think that somebody that's a 20-year-old wants to be called either a child or a youth. But we stick with that term just because people know what it is. It's a Child and Family Team Meeting. And those are not covered in state plan services, but those are funded with this, with what we call a case rate or a service-based enhancement. And we also provide care coordination, which is another thing that isn't really covered in our Washington state plan under Medicaid, but is paid for with some state dollars. We require the use of cans as a screen to show medical necessity, and also as an outcomes tool. And we'll share this slide deck with you. And we got lots of information online, and there's a link to that for anybody that wants to look at any more information about WISE. So this is the place where I became familiar with CANS. It was a decade ago that I first met John Lyons and the Parade Foundation folks in Seattle when we had the conference here. And then I've become increasingly familiar with CANS during that time. We've been really happy to use it because it lets us do the kinds of outcomes measurement that we were really struggling with and never got to in either marijuana prevention or tobacco prevention and control when I was at Department of Health. They probably are better equipped to do that now, but at the time we just didn't have that kind of individualized input. All right, so this is a picture of a porpoise that we took. I think it was February when we were out on the Sound. My wife and I decided to don the wetsuits and go out even though it was cold. And we got this picture of a porpoise just by Stellicum, Washington, just north of Olympia. So as I mentioned, WISE is based on those wraparound principles to meet where and when they are, the USO system of care. And one of the goals that we want to do is to replace as many of the formal supports, people that are paid to care, with natural supports, people that care even though they're not paid to do that. And so those are some of the outcomes that we really want with WISE. And as I'd mentioned, we expect to use CANS. I think many of you are very familiar with CANS, but I won't assume that. And so I'll just give a brief overview of what that means. I think it's important to note that while CANS is a tool that we use to quantify the needs and strengths, rather than using just a text and narrative, CANS is not an assessment, or we don't want to treat it as an assessment. What we've learned is that people think that means we got to read a list of questions and get answers to those questions. We don't want it to be an interrogation or the Spanish Inquisition. We want this to be an opportunity to tell a story. And by telling that story and putting numbers to it, it means that we compare individuals over time, or we compare groups of individuals at a snapshot or over time. And by using that as a way to quantify the stories, it allows us to look at those kinds of data in a way that really is hard to do by a story and by a text narrative. Well, let me just go back. I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with this, but just as a reminder, for needs, we say that if it's a 0, it's not identified as a need. It doesn't mean it's not a need. It's just not identified as a need. And one of the things that we're aware of is sometimes those needs go up over time because the family and the youth aren't ready to share what their needs are yet. This is certainly the case with substance use in many cases that, initially somebody doesn't talk about their substance use and it becomes apparent later that it is. A 1 is something that maybe there's disagreement on, or maybe it was a potential for a need. 2 says that we're going to do some action planning on it. And a 3 says we better do something right now or something really horrible is going to happen. And so conversely to that with strengths, I remember that as a 3, and this was always tough for me at first because it felt like it was backwards, but then I understood why. A 3 is not currently identified as a strength. It doesn't mean that it's not a strength. It just wasn't identified as a strength. The 2, maybe it's a strength. 1, it's a strong strength, and a 0 is a centerpiece strength. And so I kind of think of my own son and his journey in going through his world of mental health concerns. He has OCD and anxiety. A 3, not identifying any strength. A 2, well, I like music. Okay. A 1 is I enjoy playing the guitar, and a 0 means when I get stressed, I play the guitar and that reduces my anxiety and stress. And so that centerpiece strength is a 0. And the reason we do this way is so that 0 is always what we're looking to move towards, and 3 is probably, a less desirable outcome. This background picture is something that I took on May 10th, 2024. I was down at the Nisqually Reach boat ramp, and there was a huge northern lights or aurora that night. And this was a picture that I took at that point. And there were hundreds of people there at that beach with me and my wife and my son. And I also know that many of you in this audience were experienced that at the same time. Millions of people across North America experience that very same thing. And so that shared experience is something that's always really special to me. Um, Got to have some good photos of it and just wanted to put that picture in there to remind people that a shared experience is really important. It's great to have an individual experience, but sometimes that shared experience can really be a big deal. So aggregating data and put things in a shared experience is a way we can sometimes do that. This is data we actually collect. Remember, we said that we can collect data and put it together. And if we're looking at our cans, we got to have a place to put it. And we use what's called BHAS, or the Behavioral Health Analysis Solution. It's a place where it's the repository for our data. And we put our first is a screen, it goes in, and then the first cans is done within 30 days. And then 90 days after that, and 90 days after that. So this data shows our state data for people that had been in WISE for 6 months. And you can see here that this happened between October of 2019 and September of 2020. In that particular case, we looked at 1,603 kids, and we can see that this is the kind of reductions in needs that we saw by putting all those pieces of data together. And we've got different data that I pulled, but I just happened to choose this one as something to show off what we can do and what we have. This stuff is online, and so you can look at it. And so you see that 78% of our young people in WISE identified emotional control, meaning that it was either a 2 or a 3 at their first assessment or their first full assessment. And then after they'd been in WISE for 6 months, it went down to 57%. Attention started at 73%, was either a 2 or 3, and then it went down to either a 0 or 1. To 64% after 6 months. And you can see the same thing, kind of the same direction for trauma and anxiety, for family issues, interpersonal issues, living, school achievements, and decision-making. Those were the top ones that we put on each graph as we pull it. So that way we can kind of see what the top initial ones were and how we proceeded over time. It's always gratifying to see this. On an individual basis, we recognize that it may not always go down. As I mentioned previously, in many cases, we don't know the full picture at first. And so if something went up from that first assessment to the second cans, then that's not a bad thing. It may just mean that the family and the youth are being more open about what's going on, and we're getting a picture of what's going on. Usually by 6 months, we do see a reduction as we aggregate the scores, though. We hope that we're going to see strengths increase over time, and you'll notice that we see those strengths increase over time. What we don't see is as much of a big change over time as we had seen for needs reductions. And so you see that things like family strengths go up from 65 to 70%. Recreation goes from 48 to 56%. One that's always interesting to me is the spiritual religious one. In Washington State, this doesn't change much over time. It seems like we start pretty low and it stays pretty low, and that's always interesting to me. And I'm not saying that it's a good or a bad thing, but I always notice that that's one that we don't change much over time. Primary care relationship started out at 58%, went to 65%. So you can just see that at the state level, these all went up some, not as much as the needs reduced. I think it's harder to build strengths than it is to reduce needs. And we want to really focus on building strengths because that's much more sustainable. The needs oftentimes are going to be things that we're going to continue to need to address. But if we build strengths, that's the longer outcome that we really want. And this is the kind of data that we see in our system. As I'd mentioned, one of the things we can do is we can compare groups of people, and we can compare all of the regions in our state, and this stuff is posted online. And so we'll see in this, if we compare the Pierce County, which is the Tacoma area, compared to the King County, which is the Seattle area, we can see, well, how did they compare? How did they contrast? This is significant to me because several years ago, when we first started pulling this data, we saw that the initial needs looked really different depending on which region we were in. And we weren't sure if that was because the kids that we were serving looked that different, or if it was because we weren't training well enough on the use of the cans, and that maybe in some regions they were rating them different than they were in other regions. So we actually decided that in addition to having the required certification training, we wanted to also pull in some in-person training. We had Michelle Fernando come out and do a number of trainings, and we also, or April, I'm sorry, April Fernando, and then we had Dr. Lyons come out and do a lot of trainings. And that actually, we found out changed so that we saw pretty similar initial responses for cans. And so it looked less of a disparity geographically for at least the initial ones. But you will notice that in Pierce County, we see pretty much larger reductions over time than we do in King County. The guy that used to work with me from the Parade Foundation, Steve Shimshock, I think he's still around, but he doesn't work for Parade, told me a long time ago, we want to have data be a conversation starter, not a conversation stopper. So we don't want to look at any kind of data and wag our finger and say, you guys are doing it wrong. But I think it does give an opportunity to look at, when we see these kinds of differences, are there some things that we want to do different? And in this case, one of the things we would look at was, well, maybe it's just because one place is rural and one place is urban. But the fact that we're talking about Tacoma versus Seattle, similar geographically sized counties that are right next to each other, it seemed less likely that it was about the differences in geography. And what we also know is that the providers were different there. So it may be something that's at the provider level. As part of WISE in our governance structure that was required under the settlement, we require every region to have what we call a Family Youth System Partner Roundtable, known as a FISPR, which I think might be the worst acronym I've ever heard, but it's what we call it. And so those FISPRs happen at the regional level and the state level. And that's a chance for people to get together and identify places of growth. And if they can't seem to address those at the regional level, they'll take them to the state level for FISPRs. And those regional FISPRs are required to present data in WISE to their, think of them as kind of a coalition. So anybody can show up to a FISPR. And we require that, we have some involvement from our WISE providers and from our managed care organizations that oversee that. And so they can take this and say, well, this is a place that we think we ought to focus on. And maybe in King County, they would look at something like family and say, we see some reductions, but we'd like to see bigger reductions. Are there some things that we would make adjustments in our protocol, in our programmatic interventions to increase those reductions? And they could look at the same thing for the need scores. And they might say, well, why are we seeing different outcomes in this region, in this county, in this agency that we're not seeing in other agencies? And we put this data at the regional level online and is publicly available. We also collect it at the provider level, and we don't put that out on the public website. We put it on BHOS, so every provider agency can look at their own data, and they can actually look at other agencies' data too. And we encourage them to share that publicly. It always has a filter. So if it's got small numbers, it's going to filter out anything that's got too small a numbers to be shared publicly. But it's up to them on whether or not they want to share that publicly, and we let them do it. We share the stuff at the regional and the state level. But those are things that we're able to do with CAN scores to demonstrate that we've got an opportunity to make improvements. And that's the value of using CANs in a way that actually connects that data to what's coming on the outside of the outcomes that they're doing. Now, if we got outcomes data, we can only link it to data that we actually collect. You're going to see that in Washington State, we have an all claims database, and the Department of Social Health Services, or DSHS, Research and Data Analysis Shop, or the RDA is what we call them, have access to all Medicaid's claims. And if we're collecting data, then we can do an awful lot of work to figure out what that data is telling us, but we have to collect data. And you saw in the previous slides how we can disaggregate on factors that we collect, such as geography and who the managed care plan is. If we have, what if we saw a different outcome from Molina than we did from WellPoint or coordinated care? We don't, but what if we did? Well, that would tell us that there might be something we need to make adjustments to. But if we don't collect information, then we can't analyze it, and we can't disaggregate it, and we can't do anything with it. So it's important that we carefully look at the data we collect. And of course, we also have to balance administrative burden with collecting that data. There's always some level of administrative burden that comes with collecting data. And so we have to kind of balance that. But Medicaid claims gathers an awful lot of data already. And so we have that. And I'll show you what we've got here. This data comes from RDA. It's on our public site. And you will see that this is the data we collect, and it's in our WISE dashboard. So you'll see a lot of demographics that are here that have been collected since WISE started. And this data dashboard by the settlement looks pretty much the same every quarter. And that's important so that we can kind of compare over time. And you know what you're looking at. It takes a while, of course, as you look at this. What am I looking at? I don't know what that means. What's a WISE proxy? And how does that all relate? So let me just tell you what that means. RDA has access to all of this Medicaid information, and it tells us actually who's probably at risk enough based on their information they provide about risk factors that they probably would be appropriate for WISE. It was kind of blew my mind that they have that level of data, but they do. And so this WISE proxy that was established back a decade ago. So these are kind of the expectations of what we think WISE should be serving. And the numbers are probably less important than the percentages. So you look at that and we see that we expected that because WISE is offered to people from birth up through their 21st birthday, we expected 5.2% of our WISE participants to be in that birth to 5 range. We actually, when we started doing it, it was like 2.4%. And now you see it's up to 5.8%. So we're hitting that right on. And that came because we looked at the data. We saw who are we serving and who are we missing. We didn't have a lot of providers that had expertise at working with infant and early childhood mental health. And so we went out and recruited them. We worked with our managed care organization. So let's get some providers that have some expertise. Let's do some training. And so we've got we got a person on my team. Her name is Kiki Fabian, and Christine Cole also work at Healthcare Authority. They're experts at infant and early childhood mental health. They provided technical assistance, gone out and helped agencies that weren't specialists in this to become better. And we're really proud that we've now bumped that up, where we were really quite underperforming in that place of birth to 5 to overperforming now. A place that we're less proud about is this 18 to 20 range. Maybe I can actually just put my cursor there so you see the 18 to 20. We expected like 23% of our WISE participants to be between the ages of 18 and 20 based on the need. And we're at 4%, less than 4%. It's been that way for a long time. We have not made progress here. And that's a tough age range to serve. And if anybody out there has some suggestions on what you think we ought to do to make improvements, we're all ears because we've made some adjustments. We've tried to do better, but you can see that we still have a story of a place of growth. Some places that we're also quite proud is we expected about 46% of our WISE participants to be white and about 54% to be not white. And you see that that's almost exactly what we're serving. That's a big deal. And, that I think says an awful lot about the work that's being done in the state. I'd love to take credit, but I think the credit goes to the people that are actually doing the work. They know who their communities are. They know where the needs are, and they're able to get those young people and families into services. And you'll see how that is broken down. This is the way data is collected in Medicaid administrative data. So it's collected. Are you Hispanic? Are you Black? Are you African American, American Indian, Alaska Native? Are you Asian or Pacific Islander? Never like that. Putting those two together is like saying ketchup and ice cream. It's just, those usually should be disaggregated, but in this case, they are aggregated. And what you're seeing here is that we're hitting pretty close, not perfect, but in the range. We're underperforming a little bit in the Hispanic population. We expected about 21% or overperforming, and we're actually hitting 26.6. So that's a good thing. And the rest of these are darn close to what we expected. So that's great news. And you can see we got regional stuff, but I wanted to point out the information that we collect on race and ethnicity of who we're actually serving. So there's two things that we're missing. Number one, you can see what demographics are we not collecting. Where's the demographic on sexual orientation and gender identity? Well, it's not collected. So we can't tell anything about what we're serving in the regards to sexual orientation and gender identity. And the other thing that we look at is that those are pretty broad categories of race and ethnicity. And can we get some more granular information about the race and ethnicity? Because it's not there. And because it's not there, and I don't have the ability to change what data Medicaid collects, we do have the ability to decide which information we're going to collect on those cans and put into BHOS. And that's exactly what we did. That would allow us to have extra information to use their big data machine and say, well, first of all, who is our population? Who are we serving? And then we can also correlate that to outcomes. And that's some of the stuff that I wanted to show you today. This is what one of the pages in BHOS actually looks like. And it shows how we collect that demographic information. So you'll see that we now are collecting gender identity, female, male, and it's got some other choices there too. Are you transgender? Yes, no. And what's your sexual orientation? We don't collect that if you're under 13, but if you're over 13, these are all required fields. And if they say not collected, that's fine. We just want to understand why it was not collected. We understand the sensitivity of this information, and I've become more and more aware of the sensitivity of that information. And I just want to have a picture of, if we're not collecting that demographic information, what was driving that. And so that's a required field. If you say not collected, and then we want to say, well, what kept you from collecting it? And so there's an opportunity for getting that. And you'll see that the race and ethnicity is much more granular. If you identify as East Asian, I will say Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Mongolian, Taiwanese, Tibetan are not listed. Would you like to determine what it is? And all of that We can roll up into Asian if we want to, so we can aggregate that, and we can also disaggregate it. We oftentimes don't disaggregate it because the numbers get too small. But there were two things that we wanted to do. First of all, we wanted to have the data so that we can do analysis if we want to, and if we have enough power in that data to do an analysis. The other thing is we wanted people to be seen, and having a more granular way to ask about demographics. We felt like lets people say, "This is who I am," and we think that's really important to have people say, "You got who I am." And so this is what the new stuff that we did looks like. Once we collect it, we got to see what we captured. It was 2 years ago. My wife and I went on our jet ski, and we were by McNeil Island, and there are thousands of harbor seals in the Puget Sound, in the southern Puget Sound. And we looked over and I said, "Oh, look, there's a seal. Let's go up and get a picture of it," because I had my telephoto. And so we got moving up to it, and there was a boat that was there that was stopped, and he was waving to stop. I was like, "What? It's a seal, whatever." But we stopped because he's told us to, and I took a picture and got home, and then looked at the data, and we saw that's not a seal. And actually, I posted on Facebook, and one of my Facebook friends, Hong Ying, says, "That's not a seal, Paul. That's a sea otter." And that's a huge deal. Sea otters are very rare in the southern Puget Sound. When I grew up in Oregon, we'd go over the Oregon coast and they say, if you saw a sea otter, you didn't see a sea otter. It was probably something else because they just don't exist on the Oregon coast. They're starting to get a little bit more in the Puget Sound, but very rare to see a sea otter. You see river otters, but not sea otters in the South Puget Sound. So when we saw this, I didn't know what I'd seen until I actually looked at the picture, blew it up, and got some analysis from somebody else that knew what we were looking at. And that becomes relevant to what we're talking about because oftentimes, uh, you don't get it from a first look. You have to kind of look carefully and have somebody that knows what they're talking about to look at what we've captured. And if I didn't take the picture, I would have never known what I saw because when I was out there, I just thought it was a seal. Okay, big deal. But it was a big deal. And if you don't take the picture, if you don't collect the data, you don't know what you've seen. It was not a completely smooth sailing on this journey of collecting this data. This is a picture of us almost exactly a year ago because the leaves are about what they look like right now. This is Ketron Island, I think, is where we're heading towards. My wife's on the back, and I'm driving. And what you see there are swells from, I believe that's probably the ferry that was going there. And if you've been on a jet ski or even a small boat, you know that getting a wave come at you from the side can be very dangerous. It can tip you over. That water is 55 degrees. It's cold. We got wetsuits on, so we survived, but you don't want to be in the sound. And so you want to be prepared for anything. We can handle a wave like that. It's fine, but it's less about the wave than it is about how we react to the wave. If my wife on the back freaks out and starts rocking the boat, we're going in the drink, and it's going to be a cold day. And then we got to turn the jet ski over and figure out how to get back home. But we've done this for long enough. We knew it was coming. And so when you see those waves, if you're just not paying attention, that's when it's dangerous. If you don't know how to react to those waves that are coming, that can be the problem. In this case, we knew it was coming. We could see it, and we did just fine. The other thing is that it's interesting that it's actually easier to tip over when you're not moving than when you're going 25, 30 miles an hour. It's actually more stable moving than it is at rest. And like here, we were at rest, and that can be the most dangerous when something sneaks up and you're just hanging there and you're not ready for it. So that's something that I think is relevant. When is it time to launch? And this is I think, very relevant today. Is it time to launch anything that has to do with collecting data about race, ethnicity, gender identity, and sexual orientation? You might say, absolutely not. And I don't blame anybody that doesn't, but maybe I'm a little less risk averse than other people are. This is a December day, I believe. It was, I think, 37 degrees when we went out. And my wife woke me up on a Saturday and said, "Hey, it's sunny. Let's go out. Get your wetsuit on. We're going." As long as you're prepared and the conditions are okay, then sometimes going out on a day like that can be a really good day. And as long as you've got your partners in the process are prepared, um, you can communicate with a partner and partners in your leadership about, hey, we're going to go out, we're going to do this thing, even though the political climate right now might seem unfavorable. Sometimes, if you're prepared, you can do things that you just didn't think were possible as long as you're prepared. You want to determine how to respond to sensitivities and criticism. As I mentioned, anytime you're collecting this data, it's very sensitive and criticism is going to come. You don't want to provide a defensive response. You just want to provide a response that's respectful and accurate. And sometimes you can have tremendous outcomes even if the time didn't seem right. This was New Year's Eve. Again, my wife said, "Let's go out." So we took the jet ski out and saw, this is Jack. And Jack is T137A. It's her favorite orca in the world. And so we hopped on the jet ski and rode probably 45 minutes north into Case Inlet and got to find Jack on New Year's Eve. It was a cold day, but we were outfitted for it. And some people said we were nuts to try it going out there. You can see the snow up in the mountains, but it was a beautiful day and we were outfitted for it. And it was a perfect time just because I think we were prepared for what was going to be there. Here's some challenges that we experience. These demographic questions we asked needed to be vetted, and it took a long time to figure out. But you saw how we asked it. That didn't come quickly. We initially had much less questions and not as granular. And after getting some feedback from some people that we really trusted, which actually included our partners that are the vendor for BHOS. They have a lot of racial and ethnic and other kinds of diversity on their staff. And we, said, "What do you folks think?" And I asked some of our partners around here too, "What do you think about demographic questions?" Then we had to vet those decisions on how we were going to ask questions. We were very fortunate. Our leadership here at Healthcare Authority was supportive of us doing this. And we said, we're not going to get this right. Understand the first time we do it, we're probably going to get some pushback. And they were okay with that. So I want to give credit to our leadership here at Healthcare Authority that they supported us in not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. And we made progress and we did make some changes after we got some initial feedback. Getting those questions to the system were a technical lift. It cost time, it cost effort, it cost bandwidth that we couldn't do to other things, and it cost money. Anytime you make a change to a technical system, it's not free. And so it took time, effort, and money, and meant there were some other things we couldn't do. And the reports generated are sensitive, even when those numbers are above the low number suppression threshold. There's stuff that I won't share with you today because we're still in that place of vetting some of the results that we've got. We know what some of those initial results are, and they're pretty sensitive. And we want to make sure that we engage the community. Made some mistakes on that back when I was at DOH doing tobacco work, thinking that data is data and we should just share it whenever we have it without vetting that with the communities that were impacted, and learn that that's a problem. If we're going to be sharing data, let's engage the community so it's not blindsiding them and so that they're a part of that rather than feeling like they're getting hit by some bureaucrats with data. And this depends on people actually putting the data into the system. We initially saw that the number one answer for the demographic was, "I didn't ask." And so we had to make some changes to the system to make it so, all right, if you didn't ask, I want to know why. And we expect you to ask. And it's fine if you ask and the answer is no, but I don't want it to be because I didn't feel like asking. And we had to train them on how to ask for that information in a sensitive way. I kind of thought that would be something that people came to the table with. I learned that it wasn't in every case. Uh, Remember that the cans can be administered by a clinician that's a master's level. It can also be administered by somebody that's much less than a master's level. And often cases, these are peers that they're, talking from their experiences of, receiving services or taking care of their kids that have received services. And so we can't just assume that everybody knows how to sensitively ask those questions, and we got to do some training, and that's fine. It's also really important that participants need to believe that data is going to be used appropriately and that it will be kept secure. And I don't think we need to convince anybody that this day and age. We were very careful in our system design review when we came to Healthcare Authority. I was actually surprised. We moved from DSHS to Healthcare Authority, and they said, we're going to really scrutinize your BHOS system, make sure that all of that data is secure. And we went through a lot of efforts to make sure that it was secure. And uh, we also ensure our people that are providing that data, it's not getting shared with anybody. I've got access to it, a few other people too. Other than that, it's only accessed by people that have their appropriate level of access. If you're working for Catholic Community Service, you don't have access to somebody that's working at Lutheran Community Services, which is two of our providers. If that data is collected in a way that aggregates, and it does, up to the managed care organizations, WellPoint has access to their data. They do not have access to Molina data or fee-for-service data. You have to have the right access. That's very, very sensitive, and we are very careful on how that is done. And so we just want to make sure that our participants understand the sacred nature of having this data, that we really care about it. We're going to protect it, and we're going to use it. We're not going to just let it sit on a shelf, and we're going to make program adjustments based on that data. This is a spy hop. This is just a few weeks ago. We saw some orcas that were up at Titlow Beach near Tacoma. And the reason orcas do this, these are mammal hunters. They're not fish eaters. And so they're some of the transients or big killer whales. They usually will do this to look around and see what kind of prey is available. But the residents also do it, and they're just fish eaters. Why do they do it? Probably just because they're like us. They want to see what's around. Well, what did we see when we looked at all that data that we got in there? Let's take a look. This is my wife, Julie, at Browns Point Lighthouse in Tacoma. And this is her natural setting. She's either on the jet ski or she's looking for some kind of wildlife. These seals were at just a place barely north of Olympia where I am. And it's a place called Boston Harbor Marina. I don't know why it's called that, but that's what it's called. And then this eagle is over in Hood Canal. So we got to see a lot of things, and that's fun. Let's take a look and see what we see if we're looking at data. When we looked at our demographic data that we put into BHOS for transgender, well, let's look, first of all, what did we look at? This is from March 2024 to February 2025. It's kind of cool that I can pull any time frame that I want at any time. And so that's what I decided to pull. And we had 21,149 cans that were entered. These are, I think if I remember right, I did not deduplicate them, so they are duplicated. And so we will have some people that had multiple cans, but it shouldn't be too many. It was, 4, so you might have a few duplications, but that just lets you know what I actually pulled. We had 145 out of those all marked as not collected for transgender. That's pretty good. And 2,003 of them were, I don't want to tell you, and that's fine. I understand if people don't want to tell us. And 693 said that they were transgender. So that's important information. This is who we're serving. And we know that demographic of being transgender represents some risks that are pretty specific for mental health conditions. For sexual orientation, we only had 123 marked as not collected. 182 said, I would prefer not to tell you. 2,300 were marked as bisexual, lesbian, gay, or not sure yet. And then almost 12,000 were not required because they weren't 13 years old yet. And then for race and ethnicity, We had 2,371 of them that were said not collected. And we understand that that's sensitive. And I had to learn that that's more sensitive than I thought it was. I'm still on a learning journey. And 9,800 were marked as white, which meant the rest of them were marked as not white. So that's pretty well in connection with what we expected and what we saw from the demographic information that our RDA collected. What does that mean? We're going to continue to see some challenges in collecting demographic data. We haven't made it easier the last few months with collecting demographic information. And we shouldn't be surprised as we see that in any kind of effort to collect demographic information. I remember as we were seeing demographic information about who had COVID and who was hospitalized, the number one answer was, we didn't find out. And so we're actually pretty pleased at what we've got so far. And we got to continue to communicate that we're going to keep that information secure and that we're going to use it appropriately. So let's talk about how can you link all that data to administrative data? Because now we've got this more granular data, we could link it to things like hospitalizations. And you remember when I was first introducing this, that's one of our major things was to reduce hospitalizations. We could also look at other health risk factors and anything else that was on that dashboard. We could look at crisis services. We could look at psychotropic medication use. We could look at SUD need or treatment. And let's see what we got. Again, this is the Aurora. And in this case, you could barely see it. And that was just because I took a picture. When I was there, this was again down at Nisqually Reach. I couldn't see it unless I took a picture of it with the camera. So you had to look at it with the camera because the naked eye just didn't pick it up. Had to do some further analysis. We're not the only group that's looking for this kind of data. And we're going to want to stay connected with other people that are doing similar work to see, are we seeing something different than you are? And those don't always show up at first glance. So are we reducing hospitalizations? Do we see disparities? Is there a pot of gold at the end of that rainbow? Let's find out. This is aggregated data. And so RDA was kind enough to run this data for them. I'm very excited. This is the first thing we're going to be able to share this stuff with anybody. So you're seeing here that this was just barely run. And we had almost 9,000 kids in WISE with, and the time frame was January 2021 to December 2023. And we look at essentially hospitalization and crisis services before and after WISE. And so you see that we get almost 10% of our young people that are coming into WISE had one of those crisis responses, with a month before they came into WISE. And then they're in WISE, and then afterwards, following WISE, we see that go down to 3%. So we do see there's a reduction in hospitalization and crisis services. That's what we want to see. That was the whole purpose of WISE. That's really relieving to see that. And it's not a surprise. We expected to see that. What I wasn't sure is, well, what's that going to look like if we break this down with this new demographic information that we've got? Let's look at it geographically to start with. And you see there are differences, pretty substantial differences. And so you see that on the left, those are before, and they do go down, but they go down at a different rate. And so nothing to be freaked out about, but I think it's important to note that we're seeing quite a bit of difference, prior to WISE. And so you've seen King and Pierce and Spokane, more places with bigger cities, quite a bit higher rates of crisis and hospitalization than some of the smaller, less populated regions. But fortunately, we see those reduced in every single region. What does it look like when we filter for age? Not a surprise that you got less crisis and hospitalization for the little kids, the younger kids, than we do for the older kids. Females look like prior, they have much higher rates of hospitalization and crisis than males. And not a surprise, transgender, non-binary, and other, much, much higher than those that are not transgender. Her questioning, again, high. But the good news is, look at the reduction. We see that reduction that is substantial in the transgender in questioning. So we see disparities and we see an impact of the work that we're doing. So that's very heartening. Same thing with sexual orientation. So we see that bisexual, gay, lesbian, and other, that 19% drops down to 8%, where straights, 13% goes down to 3%. And so that's really good news that yes, we are seeing disparities and we are seeing that we're making an impact in pretty much every place that we look. This wasn't available until we started asking these demographic questions because we didn't have the information about who was transgendered, who was gay, straight. It just wasn't there in administrative data. And now we got that, we can look at that. We're seeing some interesting data also related to race and ethnicity. We do see some differences, but you'll see that American Indian Alaska Native is higher than white, but not that much higher. And we are seeing reductions in all of them. And yes, there are differences. And so those are, I think, important. The other thing that really sticks out to me is look at the SED treatment needs. Young people that have got both mental health and SED treatment have a really, really high rate of being hospitalized before they go into WISE. And then it goes down an awful lot after they're out of WISE. When you feel like that's exciting enough for a full tail slap. So there's our porpoise. See, I'm looking at that picture. I can tell who they are sometimes just by the notches on their dorsals. That is Uxia and his little sister Callisto. And I can't remember who this other, it's probably Callisto there too. That's the T65s. Sometimes this picture doesn't tell a story we hope for. On the left, you see a picture of an orca. His name is Indy. And for some reason, he separated from his family a couple of years ago, and he rarely gets back together with them. This was taken, when I was up in the Tacoma area, and I don't know, is that a problem? It seems like it is, but it's a reality. So we kind of watch and see what's going on. And then on the right, you're seeing this is a humpback. Name of the humpback is butterfly wings, and you have a hard time seeing it from this far off shot, but he's got a big gash in that fluke in his tail. And so sometimes we get data and we get a picture and we look at it close and say, oh, well, that tells a story of things are not completely whole. And that's a reality. Sometimes we're going to look at data and we will look at some additional data that probably tells us some things that we wish we didn't see. But that's the reality of how things work. This was just a couple weeks ago. The southern resident killer whales are highly endangered, and there's only 75 of them left. They eat fish. We don't have enough fish. And for the first time in my lifetime, we made a trip down south of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. And that was pretty special. To me, that symbolizes the recovery is possible when we got southern resident killer whales making a trip clear down to the place where they used to go and they got captured. And they finally said, all right, it's safe enough to go down there. That's a big deal. And I'll finally leave you with a picture of a couple of shots my wife took, and I was too tired to go out both of those days. Actually, one day I was at work. This is malachite on the left, and we didn't know who it was on the right, but this is again at Boston Harbor. And my wife took both of those pictures, and I stayed home or was at work. Malachite is always here he's only 5 years old, and he comes every October just in time for the baseball playoffs. And so we look at him as a Mariner harbinger. So malachite says, go M's. And with that, Mark, how much time we got left? I'm looking at my clock. We're over. We're right at time, aren't we?
We're right at time. You timed it perfectly. So if there's a quick question someone wants to drop in the chat, we can try to address that and then move on to our next session. Let's see here. Not seeing any questions at the moment. A couple of compliments. One about how the breakdown along racial and ethnic identity lines gives more voice and choice was the comment. and just, a lot of great presentations. I will say that, Paul, it occurred to me that I may want to uproot here from Baltimore and head to Olympia and head out with you on the Puget Sound one day to see some of these amazing, beautiful.
I'm going to invite
State.
anybody to come out. I'll put my email in there, and you can always email, and I'll tell you where they are that day. We follow Facebook. We're on the Orca Network, and I'm always happy to share. It's not like fishing, and you can't tell anybody where your best fishing hole is. It's better when more people are there, because then we can have more eyes. So invite anybody to come out. Love to take other people out and look.
It is unbelievably gorgeous. All right. Well, thank you so much for your presentation, for presenting the work you've been doing. It was fascinating and insightful. And we're going to end this session. And for those who are in attendance, we're going to maybe have a minute break, coffee, restroom, and then get started with our next session. So thank you again to Paul Davis. And we look forward to seeing everyone at the next session.
And thank you for joining, everybody.